Hello, I'm Dr. John McDonald, PhD, and this is 5 Human Resources. Shun Hun Po Yi Zhe. I have heard them called 5 Spiritual Resources or something of that nature. But what I want to talk about today is about the other side of emotions injuring different organs. We read a lot about how different emotions can injure different organs. But I'm more interested in talking today about how those can be regarded more as resources that we can use to enhance our lives. This is, I would add, a fairly personal view. And so a lot of people have very different takes on what Shen and Poyinja are all about. So this is my take. So I like to see the emotions, the organs, the elements, and the resources, this human resources, all as a kind of a package. And so it's all about liver, anger, and hun. But of course, it's liver and hun and wood are much more than just about anger. There are lots of important resources there for us all. The heart, joy, and shen, it's a package. The spleen, reflection, yi, lungs, grief, and po, and kidney, fear, and chu. I'm sure that most of you are pretty familiar with that already. So how do we know that there's a problem with the heart or the shen? Problem with joy, perhaps. And so at the feeling level, when there is a complete lack of joy, a person can be unhappy, flat, apathetic, unmotivated, disheartened. Probably best illustrated by the Winnie the Pooh character Eeyore. Nothing to get excited about. On the other hand, when the heart is hot, we have mania, we have euphoria, we have hyperactivity, we have very rapid speech and often gets incoherent. And thinking, apart from the feeling, thinking when the shen and the heart are healthy is that the key word is clarity. And so we have clear thinking. And we use words like clouded. The heart orifices are clouded or misted by phlegm, and the thinking becomes confused, dazed, disorientated. People can even hallucinate, and the concentration and memory becomes very poor. And in the case of mania, as we mentioned, we can have rapid, incoherent speech. So when we're diagnosing the Shen, one of the first things that we do when we're looking is look at the eyes, the windows, the soul. We can tell when looking at someone's eyes if they're listening to us. We can tell if they're awake. We can tell if they're thinking about something else, or perhaps that they're actually off with the fairies. So the eyes can tell us a lot, but also the other two things to look at is behavior and rhythm. And so obviously when people's behavior becomes quite strange, we can notice that there's something happening with the Shen. And in particular, when we talk about the extremes, we've got the person who is passive, unmoving, they don't speak, they just want to lie down all the time, and they don't want to interact, don't want to do anything. And the other thing that's important is rhythm. And so there's the rhythm of the speech, but there's also the rhythm of movement. And so early in my career, I was a psychiatric nurse, and one of the things that was really noticeable about schizophrenics was the rhythm in their movement. And so just as one example, I'm not sure whether it was the medication or the disease, but frequently you'd notice that when schizophrenics walked, there was no arm swing. The arms just stayed by the side. They didn't swing naturally the way that we would expect. And the other thing is movement would be often quite staccato. They'd move quite rapidly and then just freeze like a statue suddenly, unexpectedly. And you kind of wonder what they're doing. And then suddenly they'd move again. And that for people around them could be quite disconcerting. That weird rhythm in psychosis in terms of people that have played Hamlet, I thought that Mel Gibson actually was the one actor who caught that weird rhythm that was so disconcerting to the people around him, particularly to Ophelia. That funny rhythm with the freezing where you think the person's not going to answer you at all, and then suddenly they speak, or they move and they stop, and you think that they're going to stay without, and then suddenly, when least expected, they move again, and often quite rapidly. So that funny rhythm gives us a good insight into the fact that the Shen is not in good shape. And the corollary of that is, when you see people moving with magnificent grace and excellent rhythm, you hear people singing or playing music, dancing, doing gymnastics or whatever it is, when you see a really lovely rhythm in what they're doing, then it really tells us that the Shen is in good shape. So this is actually my Brazilian percussion teacher, second from the right, Carlinhos Gonçalves, along with two very famous international Brazilian musicians, Egberto Gismonti and Naná Vasconcelos, taken in Sydney quite some years ago. Carlinhos was my percussion teacher, and also as an international jazz musician, he played with a lot of the big jazz bands around Sydney. And he found something very unexpected. When he plays drums and percussion, every drum, cymbal, bass drum, everything is just another instrument in his percussion orchestra. And so it's very un-Brazilian to go boom, 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 boom with the bass drum. And yet that's what most of the jazz bands in Sydney were doing. And what he discovered was that the bass guitarist was following that boom, boom, boom to give the band its rhythm, thumba, 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 on the bass, on the double bass, following the bass drum. But then the double bass player is looking for Carlinhos going thump, 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 but he's not. He's playing all manner of complex syncopated rhythms, and the double bass player just lost his rhythm, and then the whole band went off, and then they got quite angry with him. And he was, first of all, surprised, and then he became rather annoyed. He said, look, these guys are musicians, and so they're supposed to know the rhythm themselves. They shouldn't have to listen to someone else to find where the rhythm is. And he said, you know where the rhythm is, don't you? He said, Esto no peito, rapaz. It's in your chest. Your rhythm is in your chest. We all have a heart, and that heart tells us the rhythm. We listen to our heart, and that gives us our rhythm. We don't have to listen to other musicians. And quite frankly, as far as Brazilian musicians concerned, other musicians leaning on other musicians for their rhythm is considered very poor musicianship. So, listening. We listen to the speech and the laughter. It tells us a lot. Is the speech tangential, so the person can't actually organize their thoughts and keeps going off at tangents all over the place? They have pressure of speech. There's actually a whole series of what's called thought disorders manifested in speech in psychiatry, which are all different weird things that happen in speech, like echolalia, where a person gets stuck on a word and then suddenly they branch off into other words that rhyme with that one word, and just get completely, their train of thought gets completely derailed. Sometimes speech is incoherent, sometimes speech indicates magical thinking, sometimes that the person is delusional, and sometimes the person just isn't speaking at all. There's lots of different sorts of laughter, and the laughter again can tell us a lot about the Shen. So is this a brittle laugh, a nervous laugh, an embarrassed laugh, a nasty laugh, a cutting laugh, an evil laugh, a manic laugh? Or is it the sort of laughter, when you hear it, you just can't help but laugh too, because you just can't resist laughing when you hear the sound of that sort of laughter? Okay, asking. So when we talk about listening and looking and asking, some people call it they translate surgeon as the 4 diagnostic methods, and I really don't like that translation. really it's the four methods of physical examination and case history taking. So we've talked about physical examination. Now we're talking about case history taking. So it's quite classical in psychiatry to test a person's orientation by asking them questions to see whether they're orientated in time, place, and person. And so a typical orientation question will be, do you know what time it is? Do you know what the date is? Do you know what month and year it is? And in some cases, people with mental illness will be severely disorientated, and they will be extremely surprised to find out even what year it is, because in their reality, they're living in quite a different time frame. Place, do people know where they are? And we're talking about the context there. And so in psychiatric nursing, it wasn't uncommon for people in a psychiatric hospital to refer to me as a nurse. They'd call me guard, they'd call me constable, officer, steward, waiter, all sorts of things. On one occasion, an elderly lady, this was in a nursing home, not in a psychiatric unit. She was sitting in an armchair in a room, looking through a window at the clothesline in the backyard of the house next door. And she said, "Oh, excuse me, steward, could you please ask the captain if I could have a cabin with a porthole?" So clearly she thought she was on a cruise ship. And person, well, no, I was not a waiter, I was not a steward, I was not a police officer or a guard in jail, I was actually a nurse. Concentration. And so again, in psychiatry, there are numerous tests that are used for concentrations. For example, asking a person to do tasks that require them to stay focused for a period of time. The classic is serial sevens. Okay, start at 100 and count backward by 7. 100, 93. So a concentration task. Short-term memory is also something that's often tested in an interview. And so that can be things like giving a person some information at the beginning of an interview and then asking them later about that same information. So, for example, you might introduce yourself by name, and then 5 minutes later you might say, "Oh, by the way, do you remember my name?" And so that's short-term memory testing. There are other formal ways of doing that as well. Abstract thinking, that's an interesting one. In schizophrenia, people lose the ability to make abstract connections or abstract extrapolations. They lose metaphor. Everything for them is literal. And so, just as an example, the conversation might go like this. Birds of a feather flock together. What does that mean to you? Oh, it means crows fly with crows and pigeons fly with pigeons. Do you think it might have anything to do with how people choose the company they keep? No, I thought we were talking about birds. And so the capacity to make an abstract connection from metaphors is just not there often in, particularly in schizophrenia.